Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 133. Mornings had started to fall into a new rhythm. Shota would walk with Midoriya to class and sit at his desk rather than sleeping in the teacher's lounge for an extra half hour before class started. He hadn't expected Midoriya to follow him, but he had been. He just wanted to be accessible should the kid need him, though it seemed like Midoriya thought that he was caging him into the classroom. Either way, it was probably good to force him to socialize a bit. He'd been isolated for long enough. His friends certainly seemed happy that he was in class early enough to chat with him. Another sad thought struck him as he watched them out of the corner of his eye. Midoriya hadn't had friends before this, had he? Maybe acquaintances, but you can't hide that much of your life from actual friends. That's probably what had happened with whatever the situation with Shinso was. He'd likely need to be brought into the investigation because of that. Damn it. That was going to have to wait for another day. The kid was still settling. Maybe he could get some information out of Shinso during the internship without having to divulge any of Midoriya's personal information. That was a long shot, but he could hold on to hope for now. The rest of the class filed in, and the bell rang as he sat there thinking about Midoriya's case. He'd yet to really start it. He'd been too busy getting everything settled at home. He wasn't going to be able to put that off for very much longer. Internship choices are due. Have them ready. I will be coming around to collect your form shortly, he announced as he stuffed the paperwork he had made no progress on back into a folder. As Shota gathered all of the internship submissions, he didn't even try to not peek at who Midoriya had chosen. He glossed over everyone else to review during lunch, but he couldn't brush aside his curiosity for his, charge's choice any longer than he already had. When he read the name at the bottom of the paper, he had to stop himself from doing a double take in front of the entire class. Endeavor? He chose Endeavor? Of all the crazy, out of left field options he had thought of, Endeavor didn't even make the list. He could remember at least 3 times offhand that the kid had shit-talked that man. Granted, he had done that as Ivy, but they were one and the same. Given the discussion questions Midoriya had answered for his class, it didn't seem like Ivy's morals and values were any different from Midoriya's, despite the dissonance between their personalities. Ivy hated Endeavor. They had said so quite explicitly on several occasions. So why the hell would Midoriya choose him? He shouldn't have read it. He wasn't going to be able to focus properly until he talked to Hizashi about this. He turned his back to the class as he picked up a piece of chalk and sighed as subtly as he could manage before he started the lecture. Eraser didn't seem pleased by his choice of internship. His brow raised as he read it, and his step faltered before he turned around to try and hide the sigh he let out. He couldn't make him change his decision, could he? Izuku couldn't tell him why he'd chosen who he'd chosen. If he did, then he would insist on handling the situation himself. But A, Eraser had enough shit going on right now, and B, Izuku knew full well that there was information that he could get undercover that a proper investigation would never even brush the surface of. If this situation had gone unchecked for so long, then Endeavor either knew how to shut people up or cover his tracks. He would be able to catch narcs sniffing around his business. But Izuku was unassuming. A man that arrogant would never think that his downfall would be at the hands of some random kid. And he needed to use that to his advantage if this plan was going to work. Moreover, anyone else leading this investigation would have to report it. Izuku didn't. He would gather the intel. He would make the case. Then he would present it to Todoroki. If Todoroki didn't want to report it, then he didn't have to. Ripping him out of his home wasn't Izuku's choice to make. He knew firsthand how awful that was, to have your whole life torn to shreds. Todoroki would be 18 in 3 years. If he would rather not disturb the peace and wait it out, then that was up to him. His siblings were already old enough to live on their own. Why they still lived in that house of their own accord wasn't something he had an answer for, especially if they weren't allowed to interact with Todoroki. Hopefully, that was something he would figure out over the course of his snooping. More than any of that, he needed this selfishly. He had a purpose again. He couldn't bear to have it taken away like everything else. They were going to ask him about this. He knew they would. And he needed to come up with a solid argument as to why he made this decision. He had a feeling that that argument was going to be due tonight at dinner. He fought back the urge to let out a sigh of his own and started taking notes. Shota, 9:47 a.m. Building lunch. Shota sent off the code emoji they used to use in high school which was short for meet me on the roof. They used to have lunch up there when the weather permitted. He spent a lot of his free time on that roof when the campus was too loud and home was too quiet. The little code started when Oboro or Hizashi would text him asking where he went, and eventually he just started responding with that because it was easier. Hizashi, 9:48 a.m. Did something happen? Shota, 9:48 a.m. Not anything crazy, but we need to talk and I need some air. Hizashi, 9:48 a.m. Thumbs up. Have you seen Yagi today? He looks awful, Hizashi said as they stepped out onto the rooftop and spotted Shota. No. I assume he's continuing to not take the lack of info well, Sho replied. I didn't ask. There's nothing I can tell him anyway, they answered. Sho just grunted in acknowledgement as they sat down next to him. So, what do we need to talk about? They prompted. Few things. You remember what happened on the first day of classes with Midoriya and Shinso? Oh shit, they cursed, seeing where this was going. Yeah, I'm going to try to talk to him about it during the internship without spilling the whole story. But I doubt we're going to be able to get away with not interviewing him about what happened between him and Midoriya. Sho said in a tone that indicated he had more to say. Hizashi waited patiently. I don't think he had friends before UA. I think he dumped Shinso, for lack of a better word, because he was getting too close to figuring out he was homeless. He trailed off. So they waited for him to continue whenever he found the words. He didn't have anyone besides me and that cat. Oh, they hadn't forgotten about that night. They didn't think they ever would. But it seemed as though his brain had put up a block, preventing him from recontextualizing the incident. Midoriya would have been 14 when that happened. Only 14 years old, and he was ready to put a bullet through his head and end it. The worst part is that Hizashi couldn't blame him. The fact that this kid was still alive was nothing short of a miracle. Several miracles, actually. Frankly, an innumerable amount of miracles. They remembered the night Sho had found Ivy sitting a little too precariously on the ledge. That was less than a year ago. They really needed to get this kid in therapy. Well, he's got friends now, and he's got us. We won't let him down again, Sho. They insisted after a long while of sitting in silence. That doesn't change what happened, he remarked bitterly. No, it doesn't, Hizashi agreed. They started picking at their food when Shota didn't bring up another topic. They both needed a minute to deal with what Shota had said. Eventually, he spoke up again. He chose Endeavor for his internship, he stated with an undertone that said he was not pleased. Hizashi nearly did a spit take. Endeavor? He asked incredulously. Yeah, he hates Endeavor. I don't know why he picked him. Shota confirmed. Hizashi very generously tried to think of anything that Endeavor had to offer Midoriya, and after several minutes of staring off into the middle distance, all he could come up with was that it looked good on paper. Endeavor was the highest ranked hero to have sent out offers, but from what Sho had told him about Ivy, the kid didn't much care for chart toppers. He's on the approved list of agencies. As his teachers, we have no right to stop him. Sho continued, but as his guardians, we do. Hizashi finished the thought Shota had started. Shota hummed in acknowledgement, but didn't clarify his thoughts on the matter. He wanted to know what they thought first. He thought it was an awful idea. Endeavor had very little, if anything, of use that he could teach Midoriya, and after being informed that the kid had burn scars covering half his torso, they doubted being around Endeavor would be good for his mental health. It was a terrible choice, but it was his choice. He had just gone from near complete freedom to not even having the choice of going back home, however shitty said home was. The social worker had said it herself. This was Midoriya's choice. They couldn't take that away from him. I don't think we should tell him he can't go with Endeavor. We can discourage it, but he needs to be able to make the choice himself. He'll have other internship opportunities in the future, and if he does want to go the limelight route, then this is a strategic choice, they concluded. Yeah. Sho shot back with disappointment in his tone. They sat for a long time after that. They'd both finished their lunches and they needed to head back inside soon. If someone really needed them, they would have gotten a message by now. But there was certainly something someone wanted from one of them by now. They'd been up here for nearly half an hour. I don't know where to start. Shota said, apropos of nothing. Don't know where to start with what? The case. I want to give him time, but anything I start digging into is just going to make things worse. Nothing about this case is going to make anything better for him until it's over, Sho, he pointed out. He waited for a moment before he stood. He hoped that Sho would follow his lead, but he didn't. I don't want to make things any worse than they already are, he said without looking up at them. They frowned and let out a sigh before they walked over in front of him and offered a hand to help him up. We don't have a choice, love, they reminded him with as much sympathy as they could. He met their eyes for a moment, but dropped his gaze quickly. They watched as he worried his lip and sighed before taking their hand. He felt like he needed an entire week off in order to even begin to adequately start processing everything that had happened in the last few days. But time kept on ticking. The world wasn't going to stop and wait for them to catch up. He knew that. But gosh, wouldn't it be nice if it did? As expected, the moment they walked back into the building, they were met by someone who'd been looking for them. Though, given who it was, they figured he hadn't been looking very long. Nezu stood in the hall next to the roof access door and smiled at them as they entered. Ah, gentlemen, I didn't want to interrupt, but I felt it pertinent to inform you of something regarding your charge. Forgive me if he's already informed you, though I assume that he hasn't. He had a chat with All Might yesterday afternoon. I don't believe that he knows that you two have taken him in for housing, but he does know that he was abandoned and that you are leading the investigation, Aizawa," Nedzu informed. Shota looked at them the same way they looked at him. They were furious, and Sho didn't look much better. "I told him not to press," they said, turning back to Nedzu with a clenched jaw. "I do believe the information was offered of his own volition," Nedzu informed. "Damn devil's advocate. If you would like to continue this conversation, I would recommend we do that privately, though there isn't really more to be said," he added before turning around and walking away. They shared a charged look with Shota before turning on their heel and making their way toward the teacher's lounge. "Hizashi, what are you doing?" they heard him call after them. "I'm going to go talk to him," they replied without turning around. "Talk to him or make a scene in front of half of the staff?" he challenged. "I'm not going to make a scene," Shota cut him off with a hand on his shoulder, halting him mid-stride. "We can talk to him later. We don't need to try and hash this out midday. You already said he looks awful, and I doubt either of us are going to come out of that conversation wanting to teach for the rest of the day anyway. So just cool it." They shot him their best "I know you're right and I hate you for it" look, but Shota just rolled his eyes. "Come on, we need to get ready for class anyway," Shota insisted and started dragging him in the opposite direction, away from the teacher's lounge and toward their classrooms. Both Aizawa and Yamada had been glaring at him for the latter half of the day, so he wasn't very surprised when they asked to speak with him once classes had wrapped up. They ushered him to a disused classroom and shared a charged glance with one another before turning their focus back to him. Their combined stares were a little intimidating, but he didn't let his trepidation show. He wondered briefly what he could have messed up so badly that he needed a joint lecture. But he didn't have to wonder for long. Aizawa was never one to beat around the bush. "What did he tell you?" Aizawa demanded. "Ah, yes, Midoriya." Toshinori looked between them for a moment. How much did Yamada know? They were talking about Midoriya, right? Why was Yamada involved, but not him? He was missing something, but he didn't know what, and he didn't like that. He'd missed too much when it came to Midoriya, and he feared what else may be hiding just outside his field of view. "Midoriya, you spoke to him yesterday. What did he tell you?" Aizawa prompted again, seemingly far too impatient to let him catch up. "Well, Yamada wouldn't be here for this if he wasn't involved in the case. Plus, given their conversation the other day, they already knew more than he did. He told me his mother left him several years ago, and he's been on his own ever since," he replied solemnly. "I told you not to press him, Yagi." Yamada spoke up in a tone much colder than he had ever heard from them. The guilt that had hardly settled in his gut churned with renewed vigor. He had been beating himself up enough. Yamada's accusation and clear disappointment did not help. It felt like this feeling was going to eat him alive from the inside out. It felt like his guts were being chewed up, and he had more experience than most as to what that actually felt like. Thankfully, he also had more experience than most at ignoring that feeling. "I didn't. I found him in a back hallway by himself after school, and I just asked him if he was all right. I wanted, I needed to know he was safe. I've already failed him so much." He trailed off, half because he didn't have the words to talk about how he felt right now, and half because keeping secrets was so deeply ingrained into his mind that he stopped himself before he could say too much. Nedzu had said that Aizawa was going to find out sooner or later, and he didn't doubt that. He knew Aizawa was a thorough man. But did he trust him? Not only that, Now that he knew it was possible that All for One was still alive, could he live with himself putting Aizawa in the very dangerous circle of people who knew the truth about his power? Well, about young Midoriya's power now. He had failed that boy so many times. He needed to tell him the whole truth now that he knew that All for One could still pose a threat, but he clearly had enough on his plate. Yagi? Yamada's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Sorry, I got lost in my thoughts. My apologies. What were you saying? He apologized quickly. This is an ongoing investigation. You can't go poking your nose in it. And besides that, you shouldn't press him for any more information. He is in a fragile state right now. The situation is very delicate. He needs to focus on himself and his studies. Aizawa stated flatly. Yes, of course. I didn't mean for. He cut himself off and took as deep of a breath as his remaining lung could manage. Let me know if I can be of any help, please. At any time. For anything. Aizawa's critical gaze latched itself onto him. He had been looking at him this whole time, but now it felt like he was being dissected. The man had a very intimidating glare. It certainly kept the students in line, and now that it was turned onto him up close and personal, he could see why. Whatever he was looking for, he either found or gave up because his eyes flicked over to Yamada, who seemed completely unaffected by the look he was receiving. The two of them had known each other for quite some time, so he had probably built up a tolerance to that critical eye. It was something about mental type quirks, he thought. Young Shinso seemed to have that ability as well, though he usually used it to stare daggers at his protege for reasons that Toshinori was not privy to. He had been meaning to ask, but, well, that was going to have to wait. Do not talk to him about anything that is involved with his home life or his past. If he offers any information on his own, then bring it to me immediately. Aizawa instructed after having a silent conversation with Yamada. Understood, he replied with a stiff nod. As prickly as Aizawa was, he appreciated him being one of the few people who didn't shy away from Toshinori's rank and title. He treated him like he would treat anyone else, which was refreshing, even if it was usually rather unpleasant. Yamada was similar, but he generally treated everyone with the same level of enthusiasm and kindness, so it was less noticeable in their interactions. He wanted to trust them. He really did, but he couldn't loosen his grasp on such a closely held secret so easily. He had a feeling it was going to be forced from his grip before he allowed himself to give it of his own volition. Aizawa sent one more glare in his direction before nodding and leaving the room without another word. Yamada exited in a similar fashion, which left Toshinori feeling like he had done something wrong. Well, something beyond the obvious. Yamada was never that cold to anyone. What was going on? End of chapter.